Our next speaker has been acquiring, starting, operating, and selling businesses for nearly 40 years. Now he uses those lessons learned to coach and inspire fellow CEOs to achieve even more than they think possible. But perhaps his most valuable lessons have actually been learned in the penitentiary. He's now an executive business coach with Vistage. Please help me give a warm welcome to Tom Morgan.
If you'll allow me, I'd like to invite you along on a journey that I've been on for about the past 6 years. It has several different aspects to it, and I can tell you, if you take away no more than 2 things from this, I'd like to write down love and time span. So this journey started for me when a friend of mine, Jeremy Brown, some of you may know him as a local publisher, and I were talking about his work with inmates here in Sioux Falls, mostly at the county jail. And of course, that conversation, he was sharing a book with me about the problems of intergenerational poverty. So a fact that I learned in reading this book, which really got my interest going, was that the typical person who's stuck in a cycle of poverty has a vocabulary that's limited to about 600 to 800 words. Now that kind of caught me off guard because I had never made an association with linguistic skills, vocabulary, the ability to construct sentences, writing and communicating with poverty, but the connection is obvious when you think about it. And sadly, oftentimes in that 600 to 800 words, a lot of them are 4-letter words or monosyllabic words. They're not necessarily informing words. And this will become important in a second. So continuing on that journey, I began to do more reading and studying and research, and much to the chagrin of my beautiful wife, more books kept showing up in my library. But I learned along the way that there are built-in limitations that some people have. Now, I'll share also along this journey that I consider myself a scientist at heart, trained originally in science before I got my business degree and before I got my bioethics degree. So I've always had a curiosity about what's the underlying science that might be contributing to or potentially offering solutions to some of these problems. So in the course of that, I did further study and began to learn that there are associations that accumulate over time, especially in intergenerational poverty. So we find, for example, when parents raise, more often a parent, raise children in an environment of poverty, especially really harsh poverty, defined as not knowing where the next meal is coming from. That's generally our definition of poverty. And do that week over week, month after month, year over year. Those children, not surprisingly, go from the uncertainty of poverty to despair. Now, a lot of what we've learned in science, especially over the last 20 years, is informed by new knowledge that we have of how the brain works. And much of this new discovery comes from really harnessing the power of MRI. So we can actually now study live brains, functional MRI. We can actually map things that are going on inside the brain. We don't have to wait until the patient or the subject dies to understand what's happening in the brain. And the other is, of course, the explosion of knowledge in the area of genomics and its closely related fields of cell biology and molecular biology. So an example of a significant piece of information about the structural intergenerational poverty, we now know that there are actually genes that get down-regulated inside the amygdala, which is where our emotions emanate from, and especially limit things like serotonin, which is sort of happiness or helps you get to sleep. There are different effects of the molecule of serotonin. But we now can actually measure the decline of this in these children or young people stuck in intergenerational poverty. Another part of this study took me into an area that we generally refer to as the boy crisis. So epidemiologically or statistically within our population, we have a massive problem going on with the decline of life expectancy in males in our society. So we oftentimes think as a first world country with a pretty well-developed medical system that our life expectancy is continuing to increase, which it is for females, but it's actually declining for males. Now, the typical problem we run into or see with that is we run into or diagnose or can really understand that some of the root causes of the threat to the male gender within our society have to do with things like gaming, pornography, drugs, social media generally, diversions, distractions, etc. And these are actually now we can prove are actually decreasing sperm motility and fertility. So as a society, demographically, we're under pressure. And the data shows this, the demographic data show this, that our replacement birth rate in the United States is down at 1.8. So the actual replacement rate that a society needs is 2.1. And if it weren't for in-migration, we would be even lower. The actual, what's considered to be the death signal for a society, which Japan is below now, is 1.3. Russia is right on the border, on the door of that because of decades of bad central decisions that have taken away the desire and the will to live, especially among men. Susan and I happened to be on an exchange, a medical exchange in Moscow, which was then the Soviet Union, so that gives you a sense of time when it was, 1989. And we had a conversation with a lot of the doctors there about, hey, we understand that you guys don't have drug problems, alcohol problems, et cetera. And they said, that's bullshit. We have all those problems, we just hide them. And we know that, and we see that elsewhere. So we know that there's a systemic problem with how, especially males, but generally throughout the whole first world, how our future societies are going to be shaped. Won't get into a conversation about AI and all those potential changes, but just looking at where we are right now and how we got here, it's important to understand that. And why is that important? So I was having dinner one night with Susan and I were with some other friends of ours who work with kids, mentor kids in our schools. Bill and Kathy Harrison, a lot of you know them, and I think they might even be here. And Kathy asked an interesting question. She was working with two brothers. I'm not sure they had the same father, but just say two brothers. And asking the question of how to help them, how to help these two young boys who are in our public school system here in Sioux Falls, whose mother's stuck on this intergenerational poverty, welfare, not able to work varyingly, et cetera, the lack of consistency in their lives. So she asked me a great question, and I don't know if I had a very good answer, but I've been testing the thesis of my answer since then. And here's what I said, and it didn't really come from me. I think it was honestly the Holy Spirit. And I challenged her to say, when you're meeting with those two boys next time, ask them to think of somebody who's actually worse off than they are. Because one of the things that happens when we get into this cycle of despair is, woe is me, or it's not my fault, or I don't know what to do. All of those are very real, honest reactions. So if we're going to break this cycle, those are the things we need to change. So I said, why don't you just ask these guys to think about somebody on the schoolyard or that they know that might be worse off than they are, and ask them if they can help them with what, not financially, not with anything they have, any possessions, but with love. One of the words you already written down, right? And love, in my definition, and oftentimes, but the one I'm going to stick with here, is the willingness to put other people's interests ahead of yours. So in business, we often, motivate people by measuring their performance and giving them goals to hit and whatnot. What I found that is a difference maker in the way that we might lead people is actually teaching them how to manifest love in the workplace. Now, a lot of people, especially in the business literature, won't use a word like love because it does have other meanings in certain cases or different definitions. But at the end of the day, I don't run from that word, I run to it. And so, in the context of coming up with a solution for this really difficult problem, I also was invited to participate in a couple of programs in the prison ministry that we have here in the Diocese of Sioux Falls. And I'm just going to tell you these two, and there are a bunch of programs in our system which are great, and I want to make you aware of them. Because if you may have seen in the introduction, I've really got one mission, is try to figure out how to get into heaven. And there's a sign-up list outside. And I'm not going to tell you that's a manifest for entry into heaven, but it's a good place to start. So here's the two programs that I'm going to refer to generally are one that we call Man-to-Man, which, if you have any familiarity with Big Brothers, is like Big Brothers for felons. The other is what we call REC, or Residents Encountering Christ. So M to M is really simple. As a mentor, I sign up for, and I'm just finished my second guy, I'm in my third guy right now, and I go out and visit them. It's pretty simple, just two guys talking. We don't have a lot in common, but I establish some conversation in common. And the number one thing that I've found that works in my so far limited experience, but 100% of the time, is get them talking about helping somebody else. Here's how I think of it. If you go back to the Greeks, Aristotle talked about a well-ordered life for happiness. So what is happiness? It's not laughing, having a puppy, all those other good words that might characterize you when you are happy. Happiness is fulfillment. It's mission, purpose. So if you're achieving happiness in the way Aristotle would define it, and the reality is it's the same thing that we learn in the Gospels, because I'm just going to say when I get to the end of this, we're going to say this is really what our gospel messages are. So if we strive for happiness in our lives, but more importantly, figure out how to share it. So again, as a scientist, we do a lot of research, and I'm not active in this right now, but usually if you can reduce something you're measuring to a single variable, it'll plot out in some form of a bell-shaped curve. All right, so if I were to create, and then this is an illustrative curve, not a statistical curve, create a happiness index, I might include in that things you would think of like health or wealth or great kids, whatever, and I'm blessed with all of that. But the important element in this index I'll create out of thin air here is happiness. What's your mission? What's your purpose? Why are you here? Why should God give you another day? And more importantly, what are you willing to share? So, about 7.7 billion people on the face of the earth right now. We all might fall on this curve somewhere at different parts of our lives. So if I'm doing well in business in my life and I have my health and my family's here like they are, I'm a happy, happy guy. I could get a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. A bunch of stuff could happen. I'm going to fall back down on this happiness curve. That's the essence of this curve. So usually when you're young, you don't have a lot of those things and you accumulate them, and then till you get old like me, and then it starts to decline. So here's my point, and this is the way I illustrate it. So at some point, my guys up in the prison that I work with are somewhere on that curve. And it could change. Their freedom's been taken from them. Generally, all of their assets have been taken from them. Usually their identity's taken from them. They're known as a number. So think about living your life that way. But they're men. They live in a social environment known as the prison. And they vary at different states of their own mission and purpose. There are guys up there doing great work that are lifers because they've thought this through. So I'm going to give you a story that just happened to me this weekend. I'll call this guy Rob, not his real name. He's made 66 trips around the sun. I've only made 65 so far. I'm going to try to get to 66 here pretty soon. But he was a broken man. So when we started I met him on Saturday morning. He was in my group. We organized in small groups. All of you can learn this, and I want all of you to consider participating in this because I want you on that list to get into heaven. It's a blue pad out there. You'll be able to sign up. So Roy, we'll call him, had been a community leader on his church council, tribal council, kids, grandkids, put all his kids through college, had property, had all of the indicia of success from his community and financially. He was retired. He said, here I am, and I'm not sitting out on my porch, bouncing my grandkids on my knee or fishing. And he said, I'm not getting out of here for 15 years. So that means I'm probably going to die here. You will not be surprised to think that he was a broken man when I met him on Saturday morning. And I'm not saying this is because of me. I'm talking about a process. So one of the things that, what did I call him, Roy mentioned was that, I don't want to use his real name, was that he still was reading the Bible. And he took a great source of comfort out of reading the Bible. And he said, I don't know why, but they keep giving me new cellies as your roommate, give me new cellies. And I said, Roy, that's your opportunity, man. Because wherever you are on this curve, there's somebody worse off than you. Now, and I told him this when I talked to him on the weekend. I said, you're not the 7.5 billionth person who's worse off and can't find anybody on the face of the earth who's worse off than you. You're in America to begin with. You're in a prison where you get 3 squares. You're warm. So you're somewhere a little further up on this curve. But there's somebody who's worse off than you. And it's probably a new guy. It's probably somebody who just entered the system. It's probably somebody who's being recruited by the gangs. It's probably, which do exist in the prison. It's probably somebody who's trying to get you to use drugs, and you're trying to make the right choice. They're worse off than you are. And I said, all you have to do, Roy, is find a way to help that guy out. You can't give him anything. There's nothing you can do for him. You can be a friend. You can answer his questions. You can help him see things from your experience, since he's 66 and has a tremendous wealth of experience, and life has taught him the difference between right and wrong. He just unfortunately made a series of wrong decisions that wound him in the penitentiary, probably for the rest of his life. What do you do with those facts? The reality is you don't have many choices. And the best choice is to look for somebody who's a little bit worse off than you and help them. Why is that? Fulfillment. So happiness comes when you're able to share what you know and what you've taught to others, expecting nothing in return. And even in the worst place, such as in a prison, some place where all of your identity has been taken from you and all your freedom has been taken from you, there are decisions that you can and do make every day that will change your life. And if you do them well, you'll change the life of others. So it's not that complicated. The good news is it only took me 6 years to kind of figure that out. Right? So happiness is something that we should always be pursuing. And we can do it out of a sense of our mission as we learn from the Gospels. Faith. So faith, belief in something greater, a future, as Catherine was talking about, being able to rationalize the short-term gains, immediate gratification, not taking that in exchange for the long-term delayed gratification, that's tremendously enabling. It is one of the biggest differences, by the way, in how people break out of intergenerational poverty. They build a support system and a decision-making system that allows to think further into the future. Because one of the biggest limitations, especially when you're raised in poverty and you don't have hope, which is the next thing I want to talk about, if you don't have hope, you're living for today. You have to, because tomorrow's meal is not identified. That forces you out of survival to have a short-term planning horizon. Week to week, literally. So one of the things we've learned in business, there's been a lot of research done about this, is that we can actually measure people's ability to think in different time spans. So time span stratum 1 is really somebody who thinks week to week, month to month. That's the time span they live in, and that's 40% of the population. So that's generally why they live paycheck to paycheck, why they don't think about the investment in learning a vocabulary more than 600 to 800 words has any impact on them whatsoever. Because they're not thinking about, they don't understand the risk reward about education, planning, and deferred gratification. As a consequence, their genetics actually begin to work against them. One of the things we've learned in the study of the boy crisis is that there's a science. Elizabeth Blackburn got the Nobel Prize in 2009. Many of you may be familiar with this. I know Bill's worked with Elizabeth on telomeres. So telomeres are what we call sort of the end caps of your chromosomes. So cell aging can be measured by the length of these telomeres. So as we study this at-risk population of young boys who are unlikely to be successful, make the successful transition to men and then fathers, is that by as early as age 14, we can measure that their telomeres are getting shorter than comparably aged females. So this is what we call epigenetic confirming data that this portion of our population is under pressure. Lots of root causes of that. I'm not going to get into all that, but the reality is we have to fight that. The number one way that we can counteract that is this word here, hope. So people stuck in this trend of intergenerational poverty, which sets them up to be financially unsuccessful, increases the predisposition for criminality, and especially recidivism, is that they lose hope. They lose hope about the future. So my friend Roy, that I just mentioned, had no hope coming in on Saturday morning. I can tell you by the time we got done Sunday afternoon, he was a changed man. Because his mission and purpose question had been answered, and it was right in front of him. He said, I read the Bible every day. I've read the Bible 3 times in the last 2 years, and I'm going to continue to do that. And I said, Roy, you've got these new cellmates, these guys younger than you, people who are still trying to figure out the answers to their questions. Share it. The gift to you is the gift that you're going to give to them. That fulfillment comes from changing his life, changing the life of his cellmate. Now, just as a comparator, I'll mention one other guy who I just met at the very end of the day on Sunday. I was up there this last weekend. I don't even know his name. I think it was Bob. And he said, I really need to talk to you. I said, well, I'm here for you, man. What is it? And he said, I have no hope. I said, well, okay. Well, tell me why. He said, I just don't have any energy. I can't get out of bed. I lay in my bed looking at the ceiling in my cell. And I just don't have any reason to keep living. I'm just here. So unfortunately, that's somebody who needs hope over a period of time. Not unfortunately, we all do. So I didn't have much time to talk with him, but I did. And I said, look, you just got to look at what you have going on and figure out who you can help. Who is this one person that's just below you that happens to be in your cell block? It narrows the population quite a bit. Who you can share some of your trials and tribulations with. Not to have him help you solve your problems, but by you asking to be his friend, to ask and answer questions that may be bothering him. You can't do anything to help him out, but you can be his friend. Because, Bob, you don't really feel like you have a friend right now other than me. I'm your friend, but I've got to leave here. So people like that need you to be in this man-to-man program. Because you're going to change their lives. And I'll give you another example of that. So my last M2 got out on parole 4 months ago now. Matachikata, little bear, is his Lakota name. And I started working with him on this concept 2 years ago. And just with this basic thing. He's 37 at the time, 4 kids, mostly the same mother. But distance from his kids, been in the system in various stages for 20 years. And I challenged him with the same question. I said, look, find somebody who's younger than you, who's coming in here, who's just is afraid. And need somebody who's got the experience that you have in here to allow him to be less afraid. And teach him, show him, encourage him to ask better questions himself, to make better decisions himself. Because there are plenty of ways you can screw up inside the prison too, by the way. I'm just saying, it's not exactly a holy place. But the good news is there are a lot of holy people in there, and a lot of them are wearing jumpsuits. So you look for that. You always want to find that. And the ones that have that potential, this is very much a dynamic curve, by the way. It's not static. It's just like when we plot wealth, for example. Wealth, you don't stay rich forever. You really don't, because sometimes you're going to come down here and you can't put it all in your coffin. And lots of other indicia of your happiness will change over time. So it's very much a dynamic curve. So you always want to be looking for, I would say, 100% of the guys up there can be helped, but not 100% of the time. They reach moments when they're open to be influenced, to be changed, to actually start to think about something larger than themselves, love, one of the words you written down, and think in time spans longer than just getting through the day. Because we find that if we can teach people, encourage people, show them a way to think about people other than themselves, they'll stop blaming themselves. There's plenty of blame up there, and the people that we work with understand that. We don't have the ones who are basically still blaming the prosecutor or their junkie or whoever, dealer, whoever contributed in getting there. They've sort of dealt with the reality of their circumstance. So they're at that a moment in time when they can actually help themselves. So if we show them the way, encourage them and support them in doing that. So one way to do that is through the M2 program, and I call that the power of two. So the way I do my M2 practice is, our ministry is 2 hours every other week. I set aside to go up, and there's a process to check in and do all that kind of stuff. And it's not really scary, but it's intimidating to go on the inside. If you're in the M2 program, you're just going in the family visit room, so you don't go through all the screenings and pat-downs and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is it's a different environment, and you just have to adapt to it. And there are rules. So for those of you who I've already persuaded to try the M2 program, you'll have to go through a process, an application, understand the rules, and pass a little test about the rules. But the need is desperate. I can't tell you how many guys, when they knew this last weekend that I'm an M2, said, hey, can you help me? Can I get assigned to you? And we can only be assigned to one person at a time. And they can't ask us for anything, and they don't. There are rules around that. We don't actually have a relationship with them after they get out, so you're kind of safe there too. If you worry about somebody showing up on your door afterwards, they just don't do that. It's a tremendously powerful program. So 2 hours every other week, so 26 weeks out of the year, 52 hours, is my math right, a year. How many, 9,000 hours in a year? It's less than 0.5% of your time. And I can tell you it will change your life. Now, you may not do what I want you to do next, which is do 2 guys, but that's what I want you to do. I want to challenge you to think about that 2 hours every other week for 2 years, and when your guy gets out or gets on parole or whatever, because it's a dynamic population, take another one. And I cannot begin to tell you the dramatic impact that it can have on our society to fight this institutional, structural, societal problem that we have. Because these are also guys who want to be helped. Visits, when you're up there, and Jeff, my friend Jeff Alvey, who's there and was with me all weekend too, can tell you how important visits are. It's life-changing. Now, mostly those are families, but when they get somebody who from the outside who they don't know, who's willing to take the time to share that hour to 2 hours with them, it is golden. It is unbelievable. And you honestly feel like you're doing God's work. So that's love. How do we do love? We think and put other people's interests ahead of ours. Time spent is the other thing. We're going to teach and coach people to think beyond the immediate and the immediate gratification that gets them into trouble. So we just had this conversation this weekend. So if they're revenge motivated and they want to make up for lost time that they've been in the prison, then they're going to wait until they get out, and then they're going to go get drunk or high or find their girlfriend or do whatever, right? And that's actually setting them up to come back. And the revolving door is really a revolving door. Because usually the behaviors and the people they hang out with are the ones that are going to get them back in there as well. And we have this conversation, it's really, because it's true, I said, most everybody on the outside think you belong on the inside, because you're here already. So it's up to you. You have the burden of proof to show to them that you don't belong in here, you belong out there. So what do you have to do? You have to be other-focused, not me-focused. So in the gospel, this to me is the difference between I'm going to take out their stony hearts and give them a human heart. Stony heart means I'm only caring about me. I'm waiting to get my paycheck so I can buy more beer, or worse. My human heart means I care about somebody else. It's this ability to love. Get the right page. So these are the attributes that we need to build: faith, hope, love. You know, in catechism, these are known as the divine virtues. That's why I feel fairly encouraged by saying you can sign up for your way to heaven. I'm just saying. At least that's the bet I've got going on. And I'm not saying I've got any particular insight. Like I said, I was slow to the game to try to figure this out. So, but I just see it. I see it happening in front of me. And so that's why I'm on this journey, and I want to share it with you. Because whatever journey you're on, it's not a huge expenditure of time, but I think the return on that investment will be huge. So let's talk about just the other program, the REC, Residents Encountering Christ. So our teams, Jeff, what did we have this week? We probably had about 25 people altogether. More than, roughly 50% were female, so we can have men and women. And really, the women make it way better. And they're about 3 times a year we go up on the hill, the Granite City, the big prison you think of, and Jameson is the newer, higher security prison behind it. And 2 or 3 times we have crews in Jameson as well. We also go to Springfield. There's a women's program that goes to the women's prison, which is out in Pierre. Haven't been there. And that's a little different ministry. It's a group ministry. We do that together. And it's actually a lot like what I get to do every day. I'm an executive coach, and none of my charges, some of whom are in the back of the room, are felons, nor is that likely to be the case. But we help each other. We do our coaching in roundtable. So we process issues, as we say, which is they have a chance to ask their colleagues who they trust, whose businesses they know, and whose acumen they respect, how to help them solve a problem. Because the biggest opportunity we see in Vistage, and this is true across all of Vistage, there are 23,000 members around the world, and it all functions in small groups, and I have 3 groups here in Sioux Falls. And one of the other ways in which I'm a very blessed man, because every one of my members is somebody I'd throw myself in front of a bus for. They changed my life. But one of the main things we've learned in doing that is teaching each other to evaluate the members of their team with their ability to think into the future. So this time span thing is really defined by one's ability to problem solve and communicate. Those are the 2 biggest indicators. So we promised this talk to actually give you a little insight on how to run businesses a little bit better and how to learn to lead. And it comes back to the same 2 things. Love. So I'm going to respect everyone on my team. I'm going to respect them so much that I'm going to ask them to give their best. This is what we call human flourishing, unleashing the soul. Because this animal that we employ in our business, known as a Homo sapien, has this thing called a prefrontal cortex, and they get to actually come up with new ideas and make decisions and ideate in the future. So we need to actually respect the fact that we've got a really powerful tool and teach ourselves to ask them to bring their best. So if in your company, in your leadership team, out on the plant floor, out in the field, whatever that means for you, if you're seeking and acting and rewarding people for their best, that's what you're going to get. The people that don't want to play about that, they say, just tell me what to do and I don't care, and I'm leaving at 4:25 and I'm out of here. They're going to wash out in that kind of environment because you're going to end up populating your whole organization with people who care. We call them A players. People who make the mission better by their participation. So they're leaders, not followers, and that's really what we're looking for. So that's love. Time span is, again, empowering people to actually bring their best by actually helping you solve problems further into the future. Now, not everyone's comfortable with that, and you have to find the right level because there are different strata, and there's a lot of good data on this. So trust me that this is a very reliable way to think about how to unleash human potential. Because you don't want to ask people who really thrive very well in what we call stratum 1 or stratum 2, and that's really within 1 year or less as their planning horizon. They do really well at that. It's not a negative if they don't go beyond that. In fact, you want to match the job to their strengths. And they can really deliver for the organization, the mission, and everyone else on the team, which is what you want them doing, by thriving in the environment that they are best at. You don't want to ask the person who's at a stratum 1 or stratum 2 to actually do a stratum 6 level job, which is really very strategic. It uses inferential decision-making models. It's very different communication systems, et cetera. They will struggle with it. They won't even know the language to use. So a part of what we do in attracting and retaining the best team and getting them to their highest level is try to match them to the right level. So those are things that we can learn, things that we can practice, things that will not only make our companies and our business and our community better, but allow us to sleep. Because you have people who can't carry the burden that you've asked them to do. Guess what? You're going to be awake at 3 o'clock in the morning worried about it. And those people will cost you money. They'll cost you time. They may cost you customers. because you've failed to get them into the right seat on the bus, as Jim Collins says. So that's our opportunity. But the reality is these human beings that we have, if we understand that faith, hope, and love is really an essential part of how we assess and coach and develop them, then we've unleashed what Marty Seligman now calls positive psychology, human flourishing. This is a fairly new field in the school of psychology, only been out about 20 years. And the idea in positive psychology is that that's described oftentimes as a ladder. So if you think of the ladder of accountability, we call it, I'm going to go over, there are 8 levels. But down here are levels where someone is saying, it's not my fault. It's avoiding, it's blaming someone else. It's not my fault that I'm in prison. I had a bad judge. My girlfriend ratted me out. It's not my fault I'm fat. It's all kinds of things. These are all the reactive states. The higher end of the ladder is proactive, not surprisingly. And this is where people take responsibility. That's why we call it an accountability ladder. They're being accountable for their choices and their decisions. And when they get to the highest rungs on this, you can just Google this. There's a lot of this literature. I would recommend Marty Seligman's book on human flourishing. But the top level is when you're actually practicing love. You're actually taking accountability not for just yourself, but for those around you. So members of your team. So back at the company, back at the office, back in the team you're going to lead, you want to be always working on people moving themselves, their team, their work group, their crew, whatever it is, up that ladder, that they're accountable and responsible. And you recognize that and you affirm that. You teach to it, you coach to it. You resource to it. So these are all things that are prudent business investments because of this animal that works for us called a Homo sapien. So here's the way I want to wrap it up. And I want to go back to the 2 boys that Bill and Kathy were working with. And the definition of poverty, which is really no food, not knowing where your next meal is coming from. And here's the way I like to summarize it. We all know the axiom, feed a man, or give a man a fish, you feed him for the day. Teach a man to fish, you can feed him for his life. And I think that's very true. But I think it's incomplete. And this is my challenge to you. Because I think there's a third step, which is if you teach that man to teach others. So now I've taken the consumer of information to make them into a provider, student into a teacher. I've empowered that person. I've responded to their human soul need to have mission and purpose in our society by helping someone else. I have seen it happen. It's life-changing for those people to empower them to teach others around them. So my guy, Roy, that I talked about, sharing with him that he can share his gift with others took him from being a broken man on Saturday morning to an encouraged and live man on Sunday afternoon. Maybe one other example of that. So Little Bear, who's out on parole now, I hope he's still out. The last time I met with him before he was getting paroled the next day, he came in and I said, yeah, man, you ready? Because we've been talking about all kinds of things, stuff that got him here. And I said, these are the changes you have to make. And you ready for that? He goes, yeah, I know. He says, I can't have one drink because that leads to 20. And once I do 20, then there's drugs to follow. And I just can't do that. And I want to be reunited with my son. He wants to come and live with me. But he had to make the future decision to not allow his son to drink with him. Because that's repeat behavior. That's intergenerational aspect of not only poverty, but recidivism, et cetera. So he said, I'm ready for that. I know it means I've got to tell him he can't come and live with me, even though his mom's thrown him out and he wants a place to live. He can't live with me if he's not going to change his lifestyle as well. You see how that happens? I want to create an exponential function. So go back to me with give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you can feed him for his life. Empower that man to teach others how to feed themselves, and you can cure hunger. With that kind of approach. So with that, I'll wrap up and ask you if anybody who's interested in knowing more about how we help change lives. Well, actually, I do it for totally selfish reasons, and I tell them that because it's changed my life. And they're my teachers. You can sign up out front. I've got a couple of sheets of blue paper out there, and one of us will call you or shoot you a little email with a little video clip that I'm going to create, just to explain the programs. You don't have to do anything, but I want to encourage you to do it because I think this, by definition, is a giving audience. I think you're here for a reason, and I think this is a group that's already self-selected to do all kinds of great in this society, and you already do. Don't stop doing what you're doing. My offer to you is if you think about this just a little bit differently, it won't change your donations to the St. Francis House or the Dudley House or anything else. It'll pay you back. So do it for selfish reasons, because that's what you'll get. Thank you.